The desert knew how to hold silence, how to stretch it wide like canvas and stain it with copper light. On the edge of that silence stood a young woman named Clara Redbird, her black hair unkempt and heavy with dust, her slender body cloaked in a widow's dress worn thin by sorrow. The day was slipping toward dusk, that fragile hour when the land seemed to breathe slower, and Clara's breath matched it, shallow, burdened, trembling. She carried no bundle, no token of a home, for she had none left. Only her eyes carried weight, two dark pools that had learned too early how to swallow grief. The land bore witness, though the people who should have sheltered her had already turned away. Still, she lingered at the edge of the homestead until shadows lengthened, as though reluctant to believe cruelty could be final. But cruelty, she was learning, rarely hesitated. Inside the house that once belonged to her late husband, the walls echoed with the voices of his kin. Martha Halloway, her mother-in-law, stood at the table with arms crossed, her face carved from years of scorn and suspicion. Beside her sat two sisters-in-law, both sharp-eyed women who had long considered Clara a burden draped in black lace. Martha's voice was steady but sharpened. "You came with nothing, girl, and you'll leave with nothing. My son's bones are barely settled, and already you linger like a shadow that won't move on." Her words were heavier than fists, yet fists followed too, swift, sharp pushes, a hand tugging Clara's braid until she fell to her knees. The sting of shame burned deeper than the blows. She wanted to speak, to plead for dignity, but her throat was raw with silence. And silence, too, was turned against her. By dawn, Clara was no longer welcome. Martha opened the door, the morning cold sweeping in, and ordered her out as though dismissing a servant. Clara stepped into the dirt with bare hands and a dress frayed at the hem. She looked once toward the land she had tended, the barn she had scrubbed, the hearth she had fed, but found no trace of belonging. The door closed behind her, sealing her out with finality, and she felt the sound press against her chest like a coffin lid. She did not cry, for tears had long ago abandoned her. She only walked, dust curling around her ankles, the horizon bending endless before her. Every step pressed deeper the truth that she was unmoored. Yet still, somewhere beneath the ache, a question whispered, how far could a woman walk before the world itself gave her back a place to rest? The road stretched under her feet like a ribbon of exile. Night crept across the land, stars pricking the sky one by one, cold companions to her solitude. Hunger coiled in her belly, but she pressed on, her hands clutched close to her chest for warmth. Every breeze carried scents of sagebrush and faint smoke from distant hearths, homes that belonged to others. Her loneliness was so complete it almost became a second skin. She paused at a crossroads where the moonlight painted silver lines across the dust. There her legs trembled and she fell to her knees, whispering words no one would hear. Her palms pressed against the earth as if asking it for mercy. And just as the night began to swallow her strength, she heard it, the slow, steady rhythm of hooves. A rider emerged from the dark horizon, his figure cut against the pale glow of moonlight. Boone Callahan sat tall in the saddle, his broad frame outlined by the glow of the stars, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. He reined his horse to a halt, silence settling between them like an unspoken language. Boone did not rush forward nor demand answers. He dismounted, his boots sinking softly into the dust, and offered her a canteen. The gesture was plain, without flourish, yet carried the weight of recognition. He saw her not as a burden, but as a soul undone by the world's hardness. Clara's lips touched the water, cool against her cracked mouth, and she drank cautiously, watching him through wary eyes. He said only, "Roads long to walk alone." His voice was low, threaded with something steady. She wanted to trust it, but trust was a thing she had forgotten how to carry. Boone did not press her for her name, nor why she was alone at nightfall. Instead, he extended the reins of his horse, an invitation without command. Clara hesitated, her heart thundering as if every kindness might hide a snare. Yet her legs could not carry her further, and her spirit, though bruised, longed for the smallest scrap of refuge. She took his hand, rough, calloused, warm, and let him guide her onto the saddle. They rode without words, the rhythm of the horse's hooves like a lullaby against the vast silence of the desert. Boone's presence beside her felt less like rescue, more like a quiet shelter. Still, she wondered if mercy could last, or if it too would vanish like morning frost. His ranch lay at the base of rolling hills, a modest spread of weathered wood and wide pasture. When they arrived, Boone did not parade her through the threshold with questions or pity. Instead, he pointed toward the porch, where a chair faced the horizon as if waiting for her. He left a folded quilt draped across the railing, and later a loaf of bread left on the table. Clara ate slowly, the bread dry but filling, her eyes darting to the man who moved about his home without intrusion. He seemed to understand something she could not name, that space itself can be a bomb, that silence sometimes heals more than words. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders that night and stared at the stars through the small window, asking herself what kind of man offers refuge without demand. Yet the world beyond the ranch had sharp ears. Whispers moved through the town like wildfire, tongues quick to brand her shame anew. At the general store, Clara felt eyes bore into her back as she reached for flour. Martha's voice carried across the crowd, sour and cutting. Look at her, bold enough to take another man's roof already. Widows got no shame. The words struck Clara harder than any hand, and for a moment she faltered, the sack of flour slipping in her grip. Boone's hand brushed hers, just a fleeting touch, steadying, unspoken. It was nothing more than a graze of fingers, yet it felt like an anchor cast into stormy waters. The whispers did not vanish, but in that moment Clara wondered if dignity could be stitched back together with gestures so small they barely made a sound. Days turned to weeks, and Clara's hands learned the rhythms of Boone's land, feeding the horses, stoking the hearth, watching the horizon bleed into fire each sunset. Boone seldom spoke, but his silence was not the silence of judgment. It was a silence that made room for breath, for healing. Once she heard him humming an old trail song by the fire, his voice low and gravel-soft. She did not ask for the words, but the melody curled into her chest, loosening knots that had bound her for too long. In his company she began to stand a little taller, not because he told her to, but because he gave her the space to remember she could. Still, the fear of Martha's shadow lingered in her bones. Could a woman once cast aside truly claim her worth again? The answer came one afternoon when Martha herself rode to Boone's ranch, her eyes blazing with venom, her words sharp enough to cut air. She called Clara a thief, a schemer, a stain upon Boone's good name. Townsfolk gathered, curious, hungry for spectacle. Clara felt her knees weaken, shame clawing at her throat, but when she looked to Boone, he did not step forward to shield her. He simply stood beside her, steady as a mountain, letting his silence say she was not alone. And then, with a voice trembling yet unbroken, Clara spoke. "I am no one's shame," she said. "I am a widow, a woman, and still worthy of breath." The hush that followed was vast, broken only by the wind sighing through the grass. Boone's hand brushed hers once more, not claiming, only steadying, and in that touch she felt her words root into the earth like seed. The townsfolk shifted, murmurs softening, and even Martha's fury cracked beneath the weight of a truth too plain to deny. Clara had not begged for pity, nor hidden in silence. She had risen. And in that rise she found something more powerful than refuge. She found her own dignity. The desert held the moment, stretching it wide, pressing it into memory as though it too wished to remember. Years later, when the story was spoken again, the teller's voice carried the cadence of the land itself. Salvation does not always arrive with thunder or bold rescue. Sometimes it comes with silence, with a hand extended, with the courage to speak when the world wishes you silent. Clara and Boone were bound not by declarations, but by the small mercies they exchanged, mercies that grew into a bond steadier than stone. And so, dear listener, remember this. When the world strips you bare, sometimes the greatest strength is not found in those who fight for you, but in those who stand beside you until you remember how to fight for yourself.